There was a giant wave of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth news recently, including content for Crisis Core Reunion. Although if there is any common thread in the recent wave of interviews, it's that the story will be sticking close to the original game. This was reiterated multiple times in these interviews. For many, this is a delightful bit of news, as they were concerned that Remake may go too far off the rails, and potentially into a territory that felt unfamiliar. Others find doubt in this claim and believe it is yet another misdirection in order to keep the surprises fresh. And as usual, I find my reading to be entirely different from a significant amount of the community's, for better or for worse. One that you should hit the subscribe button for, because I got plenty of these. Quite clearly, the reception to Final Fantasy VII Remake's introduced changes have been overwhelmingly positive, with the majority seemingly open-minded to whatever they're going to bring forth. In terms of its faithfulness, to some, the idea of Final Fantasy VII Remake remaining faithful was already foregone with the introduction of the Arbiters, the potentiality of Zack's return, and potentially even multiverse theory, or some sort of time element. To others, they see this element as a way to drive home the original narrative, create certain false hopes, such as the sensation that Aerith can live this time, all so that she can ultimately still die, and having those hopes crush, making you feel all the more worse. As things currently stand with the information we have now, you can honestly read this however you want to, and trust me, people absolutely do, with everyone utterly convinced of their own headcanons of exactly what's going on. Kitase urges, though, it'll stay close to the original. Massive shout out to Turquoise Hammer for providing the translation. Interviewer: with Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion being released at this time, I can't help but think about it with respect to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. In Final Fantasy VII Remake, you also had stuff like Deep Ground make an appearance. Is there any chance something like Project Genesis could be involved with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in the future? Kitase: it's true that just like how Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII's Vice appeared in Final Fantasy VII Remake, elements from past spin-off, such as premises and characters, might be fleshed out and added into Rebirth. However, as Nomada mentioned just moments ago, our plan is to respect the original story of Final Fantasy VII as things progress. We're trying to push ahead while keeping our toe inside the line, so we don't cause players to feel that the story's very premise has significantly changed. That said, Rebirth and the remaining title in the trilogy are still in the works, so please have fun trying to imagine how things will turn out. The most intriguing wording I find here is that they don't want players to feel as though the premise of the game has significantly changed. Kitase isn't the only one who doubles down on this, so does Nomada. Interviewer: that's quite surprising to hear. Is there anything more you can tell us about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? Nomada: in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, after you leave Midgar, the world opens up and the story starts to gain steam, but its crux won't differ from that of the original. I think the more familiar that players are with the original game, the more questions they'll have after seeing the trailer for Rebirth, but we feel confident they'll have fun with it, questions and all. Whether you're a scholar of the original and compilation, or have no knowledge of them whatsoever, you'll be able to enjoy this game just the same. What an interesting statement. The crux of the story won't be any different. This is reiterated many times and in many ways throughout this interview. At the same time, you also have statements like this. Interviewer: new experiences and new narrative development. Why is that? When you once again play through the mystery of Nibelheim, which is the single most important part of the original game, players would get impatient saying, yeah, I already know all this. In short, the game would only reconfirm the same plot point. Launching such a large project based on that sort of paltry payoff and gameplay experience would have been difficult. That said, if the story were to change entirely and become something completely different, it would lack any significance. The challenge we've undertaken with this project is to introduce new mysteries without straying from the original. And on a surface level, this sounds great. It sounds like having your cake and eating it too. And I do think that this is what most people imagine for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the entire remake project to play out like. Though on a personal level, it becomes sort of difficult for me to reconcile. I'm clearly the minority on that, but allow me to explain. What Nomada calls the most important parts of the original game now has new twists to it, because as he describes, it would feel boring and predictable without them. But that's supposed to happen without diverging the premise of the story. But what is divergence? To some people, as long as Zack still dies, Aerith still dies, and everyone and everything ends up in the same place it does at the end, it hasn't diverged. To them, this means that things are the same, they simply got there in a different way. To someone like me, however, I don't view the character's fates and things that happen as what I perceive as a checklist. This sort of approach to me is like we have to check off the Aerith dies box because Aerith is supposed to die in Final Fantasy VII, rather than keeping the death there because of what it thematically represented. However, don't get me wrong, the things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You can totally change certain details about the character's death and its portrayal, while still keeping those things thematically in line. But I think it's a lot more delicate of a balance than I think some might realize. The where and why behind a character's death are also pretty important. So I think people focusing on just the idea of things ending up the same is really a bit of a false equivalence to things being the same. For example, Genesis being in the Nibelheim incident is a change that warrants a lot of criticism. Even though technically all the characters and their fates still end up the same, it changes the context of the scene, and for many people this changed context hurts the scene. There are plenty of examples of these sorts of retcons in media that people draw a lot of contention with. So even if you don't draw contention with that specific example, I'm sure that there's another example out there that you would. As someone like me cares far more about the why something is happening than the what. I care a lot less about the fact that Zack died and more about why he died. I don't care that Aerith or Jessie died so much as why they died and how it serves the overall story. And thus by changing the why, you really do run the risk of changing the premise in my eyes. The delicate balance to me is to make the how and why similar enough that it's still compatible with the story. A great example of this that the Final Fantasy VII Remake team has done would be Wall Market. Wall Market is actually quite different than it is in the original game. However, I find the why and how to be so faithful to it that even though in many instances the what changes, it ultimately still feels true to what the original was. Hopefully, they will be able to find a way to do this for the rest of the story. All of this being said, if it really is going to be the same story from here on out, isn't this spoiling the new twist? This almost comes across to me as saying the new twist won't really impact the story in any fundamental way, which would then in turn make the new twists feel as though they're just happening simply for the sake of messing with you, and at that, only on a superficial level, rather than actually providing something different and new. While again, the common belief is that this will only be layered on top of the existing story, I find it difficult to believe that the meatloaf and mashed potatoes will sit on the same plate and never touch each other. While it's not impossible, it just seems improbable. And given that we literally defied destiny, Sephiroth literally tricking us into doing so, him absorbing destiny incarnate, all so that there could be some sort of negligible difference seems kind of unlikely to me, and strangely disappointing in a way. Even though the Arbiter and time element twist aren't necessarily my own cup of tea, I think I would find it even more weird if they were introduced to not actually impact anything in any significant or meaningful way. All of this is to say, it's going to be a very interesting next winter. Shout out to patron Tyler Cox and the rest of the Ultima community.